Now, with a lot of these, I briefly touched on this before, but you as a DBA don't want to be doing this manually. To set it up, obviously it's going to have to be manual, although there are some tricks you can do. But the daily, weekly, monthly maintenance, you don't need to be doing that. You don't need to be waking up at 2 a.m. to do some maintenance on the partitions. The way we see most people who have implemented any of these solutions, and this works for any of them, is doing something like creating an agent job, and whether that runs code itself, whether it runs a stored procedure, which does some work, whether it runs PowerShell, you can do it however you want. But what we tend to see is, let's say you have a monthly partition. Then before the end of the month, you'll have a SQL Server agent job that runs once a month. It will delete your old partition. It will create your new partition for the upcoming month. It's a bit more involved than otherwise, but setting it up, you want it to be reliable. So you want to put some effort into this, but once it's done, it's done. It should just run. Obviously, you need to monitor it if you have a monitoring solution. If not, if you just have SQL Server, then you want to set up, make sure you get an email if an agent job fails, so that you know that something might have gone wrong. Things break. It's part of life. That's why we're here. So you want some monitoring, but yeah, you want to invest the time to create an automated process to do this all for you. And again, that doesn't matter if it's daily, weekly, monthly. You don't just automate it. There's another option we have, and this is relatively new in the grand scheme of SQL Server, but it's storing data on Blob storage. Now, Blob storage, I assume you all know, but I'm going to cover it anyway, is something like it's usually in the cloud, and it's each provider has their own flavor of Blob storage. For example, AWS has S3 storage, and it's just a file system you can use to store data. Now, it's not somewhere you can store databases, or that you'd want to rather store databases, but it's usually cheap as hell. Now, what you can do is, if you decide that, yes, I need to keep this data for compliance, for example, or I just don't want to delete it because it makes me nervous. I completely understand, by the way. But I also am under a lot of pressure on my server. I don't want it on my SQL Server. You can actually store it as text files. You can store it as CSV, XML, JSON, whatever format works well for you in your environment. You can export that data. Now, the tool that is built into SQL Server, which is great, is Polybase. Polybase is designed to be the feature that allows you to query data that isn't in your database. Now, it can query other databases that aren't Microsoft SQL Server databases. There's a list. I won't give a list because it might change, but if you go and look up Polybase, it tells you where it can connect to and what drivers it has. But it can also connect to things like AWS S3 or Amazon Blob Storage, or whatever Google's one is called. But you can export your data over there and store it. It costs pennies on the dollar to store data in there. And via Polybase, you can still query that data. As a DBA, it's a little bit disconcerting that you can do this, but it's really useful. You get the advantages of reducing your database size. You get the advantages of the old archival history data is stored very cheaply, and it's still queryable. Obviously, you'd have to write your queries different in order to retrieve that data, But that's not a huge deal. Scott, another one of our senior consultants here, did a webinar about this. There's a bit.ly link, or if you go to SQLSolutionsGroup.com, go up to the top and look for webinars. You can find a list of our history webinars. You'll find this one on here. And you can go back and watch Scott explain what Polybase is, how it works, how it queries the external data. It's fascinating. Polybase is, just in case you're not aware too much of it, think back to when you install SQL Server, you can install the engine, you can do SSIS, SSRS. Polybase is very similar to that. It's a feature that you can install on your SQL Server. It creates it creates 3 databases that it uses to control everything. And if you don't have it installed, you can do it via the upgrader. You can add it as a feature. I'm sure you've all done that. But it's really good. It's not perfect. If you watch Scott's webinar, he'll explain the pros and cons. But it's a really neat solution if you don't want to keep the data in your SQL Server or in SQL Server at all, but you still want it to be around. You can chuck it into Blob storage and then it's just there. It's a text file. Now, it's just there. It's a text file. Again, might be a concern. If it's just stored in plain text in Amazon Blob storage, it's secure. You have to go in through, you have to go in with Amazon. You have to go through the console and what have you, to be able to access that data. But you definitely want to consider the data security. I don't consider it an issue, but if your company's particularly, if they like avoiding risk to the extreme, I'll say it politely, then you'd have to take that consideration into account.